All right. For those of you who may not be familiar with KC Global Design, I wanted to take a brief moment to introduce our collective to you all. KC Global Design is a collective of design community firms and leaders based in the Kansas City region. As many of you may or may not know, Kansas City is home to some of the largest and most impactful firms in the building industry. Through our focused work groups on innovation, awareness, and talent, we are working together to activate the region's status as a global center of excellence and to strengthen Kansas City's region ability to remain a destination for top talent in architecture, engineering, and construction and design technology. Our goal as a collective of member firms, which you see here on your screen, is robust industry concentration, a sustainable workforce pipeline, and our status as a global destination for industry expertise and innovation in Kansas City. This webinar series, which I mentioned previously, is the 6th webinar that we've had this year, is an outcome of our KC Global Design Innovation and Collaboration efforts. Our webinar series has showcased the importance of design and solving for pandemic-sized problems, and we are proud to share with you today what we think we know as we move forward in addressing this. So I shared some quick housekeeping I'll go over again. Please pop your questions into the Q&A section. We'll save those for the end. If you have any questions or technical difficulties on the back end, just raise your hand, and we have some people on the back end to support that. With that, let's go ahead and move to introductions. I failed to introduce myself, but here I am. I'm Mary McKeon. I'm the Executive Director of KC Global Design. My role is new to the collective. I've been in it about 2 months now and really excited to help advance the efforts through this position. And Nancy, could you please introduce yourself next? Oh, excuse me, Drew.
Yeah, I'm Drew Burst with Dimensional Innovations. I'm our practice director for collegiate sports.
Nancy?
Good morning. I'm Nancy Whitworth with McCown Gordon Construction, and I'm the Chief People Officer.
Dominique.
Mute myself. Oh, there. Okay, there we go. Sorry, Dominique Davison, Managing Principal of Draw Architecture and Urban Design.
Wayne.
Morning, everybody. I'm Wayne McCutcheon. I'm one of the founding partners at Intro Communications, based in Toronto, and I lead a lot of our aviation work.
And then we have a special guest, Danielle, with us today from KC Chamber.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danielle Isbell, the Manager of Civic and Community Initiatives at the KC Chamber.
Thank you all for the introductions. We're excited to have you share your insights today. To get things started, Dominique, I'd love if you could just provide some historical perspective of prior global pandemics to help set the stage for some of our conversation that we're going to be having today.
Sure. Well, it's interesting to note that a lot of what we consider current day urban planning is really a result of past pandemics. And by the way, I can't turn on my video. I'm not sure why it's been disabled, but if you want to turn it back on, that'd be great. There we go. Okay. So, going back all the way to the bubonic plague that really affected how we thought about cities, but more recently, 17th and 18th century, looking at the yellow fever, smallpox, cholera epidemics. Those all resulted in changes in how cities were thought of in terms of zoning, having more single-use zoning, changes in density, which was basically conducted through slum clearance, broader boulevards being introduced in cities such as Paris and other major European capitals, were all in response to the fear of these kinds of epidemics. Citywide infrastructure, of course, was also a big piece of that. So starting to, especially in response to cholera, managing waste and implementing citywide sewer systems. So 20th century, then, tuberculosis became an interesting change maker of everything about our lives and in our cities. Much more access to open air, city parks, introductions of balconies and outdoor spaces in buildings, even in urban settings, in high-rise buildings, so that people could be outside and get that fresh air. And also just the complete change in the kinds of detailing that we see. So, having lots of little crevices and in places for things to hide, not being able to clean surfaces very easily. That all became part of the language. So kind of modernism essentially is in a lot of ways a response to our need for a more sanitary surrounding. So it's just, it continues to be something that is shaping our spaces, but certainly has in the past. Another thing that's really kind of a fun detail that's been coming up quite a bit is just how things as simple as like brass and bronze handrails, which are have a high copper content, and copper is an antimicrobial. And so, introducing those into major public spaces like Grand Central actually, is thought to have reduced the spread of viruses. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Dominique. And as you all know, we're shaping history again. And so we asked Danielle from the Casey Chamber to talk about the impact of COVID on travel long-term as they've identified through the KCI airport.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary. So in August, alongside with the Kansas City Area Development Council, the Civic Council, and the Kansas City Aviation Department, we administered a survey to collect data on airport usage and sentiment. As we all know, we're in the process of building a new terminal set to open in 2023. And then this transformative design project has certainly been impacted by COVID-19. So we wanted to better understand how our region is responding to COVID-19 as it pertains to air travel. So we had a strong response of over 1,000 survey takers, really strong representation across industries, and about 71% of all survey takers were in their prime traveling years between 26 and 55. One thing to note is we aggregated the data based on those who travel primarily for personal reasons and those who travel primarily for business purposes. And we had a really even split. So we feel like this represents a good cross-section of our region and of users of KCI. So you can go to the next slide, please. So in order to collect data on travel volumes over the long term, we asked respondents to anticipate their travel habits in a world in which there's either herd immunity to COVID-19 or a vaccine, presumably both. And so this set of data asking people to anticipate the long-term impacts on their travel assumes that COVID-19 has been resolved in some kind of way. So we found that over the long term, most travelers anticipate a small impact or no impact to the amount that they utilize air travel in their personal and professional lives. So if you combine those who reported no impact with those who reported a slightly reduced amount of travel, we see that 78% of business travelers and 81% of personal travelers indicate that slightly reduced or no impact over the long term. So based on user predictions, we do expect travel to rebound. But we know that recovery can take a long time. After 9/11, it took the airline industry approximately 5 years before they came out of the red. So we don't anticipate that this recovery will be necessarily fast, but we do anticipate it will be eventual. And one other thing to note is that you can see that more business travelers anticipate a slightly reduced amount of travel. And we know that as businesses are learning to adjust to COVID-19, they're learning to operate in ways that, previously would have required some sort of air travel. So we do anticipate to see some kind of long-term change in that regard. But ultimately, we know that this new terminal at KCI will add immense value to our region's economy and to our local businesses. Next slide. So the survey also measured what would most impact respondents' sense of safety in the current terminal, and as well as the spaces that are of most concern to KCI users. One thing to note is we did not ask about the actual time spent on the plane because we're working with the aviation department, and every airline has different operational standards in regards to safety on board the craft. So in this, both business travelers and personal travelers had the same set of priorities. In the current terminal, travelers want to see required use of PPE, social distancing at check-in lines and security lines, and an increased amount of touch-free technology. So maybe the current day version of brass handles. The spaces of most concern for people right now, unsurprisingly, are the gate waiting areas. We know that in KCI, those can be very, very crowded and prohibitive of spreading out and maintaining social distance. In addition, boarding and deplaning the aircraft is another major space of concern, as well as the process of going through security. So, we have very quick security process, but perhaps people are concerned that there's not enough opportunity to spread out and maintain social distancing. There's also lots of objects that are touched between many people when you're sending your baggage and personal belongings through security as well. Go to the next slide. So we also wanted to understand how the experience of COVID-19 would impact KCI users' sense of safety in the new terminal set to open in 2023. So we asked users to share what they would most like to see in the terminal given COVID-19. And again, here, business and personal travelers aligned exactly in terms of their top 3 choices, as well as the rank order of importance. So the first innovation that travelers would like to see is an air filtration system that could assist in eliminating virus and disease within the airport. The next is, again, we see that touch-free technology. People are really looking for an experience in the airport that allows them to touch as few common objects as possible. And then finally, an increased cleaning of facilities as the new standard going forward in order to feel safe in the future terminal. So you can go to the next slide. We know that the terminal will be transformative to our region, and we look forward to it opening in 2023. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to track user sentiment and expectations around air travel. So we plan to do another survey in 2021, and we hope to be able to continue to track people's expectations around safety now and in the future.
Thank you for that, Danielle. Now that we have kind of that level setting on why we're here today having this discussion, I want to open it up for our first question for the panel. This first question is, what are some behavioral changes that are taking place that we think might stick around for a long time? Drew, I'll lean on you to answer first.
Yeah. So we have a graphic here, which I think might be the next slide. Yeah. And this is a fantastic example of kind of what's happening, right? We have a boom, an explosion of technology use, right? Where pent up demand, right, just sort of accelerated overnight. And this kind of goes by industry showing you the different ways technology has taken off, right? From delivery, the effects on retail, healthcare, remote learning, entertainment, and work. And really, an example to use to kind of explain this is when we look at the Spanish flu, something that was born from that was epidemiology and healthcare. Right. In other words, we learned we were not tracking diseases the way we should. We were really underutilizing the resources we had in healthcare. What we're kind of learning here is there's a pent up demand for the use of technology, and we weren't utilizing it to the best of its capabilities. Right. There's ways we could be using technology in our everyday life that would make it more effective. And that is truly what this graphic shows. The question will become, right, how does it change our broader gathering spaces? I'm in sports, so what is it going to change about the way we come together? That one's a little harder. We know in the short term there's some answers, testing, vaccines, things of that nature, but ultimately the question will be, will we go back to doing some of the same things we did before? Will we accept the same situations in entertainment, right, in retail that we had before? Or are we going to have to adapt and offer something new? that's the ones, that's the long-term implication of the face-to-face, right? Our face-to-face world is the one that's a little harder to predict. We know some of these will scale back, but ultimately that will be the question. I know Nancy has some insights as well.
Nancy, if you can share what you're seeing in the workplace from your position as Chief People Officer.
Yeah, sure. So focusing on the people side of the business, we've been really in tune to how this pandemic is impacting the workplace and engagement of our associates. And the statistics that Drew highlighted are pretty amazing when you think about how quickly we can make change happen when we go into survival mode. But the question, of course, is, will we stick with that after the pandemic? And one of the biggest, I think, changes that many workplaces has experienced is that working from home. The key word really is flexibility, offering more flexibility to work from home for those companies and position where that's possible. And I thought these statistics were really interesting. This was a survey done by CMA here locally, and I've seen other surveys that have shown similar results. And the question was, after the pandemic, will your organization be allowing more flexibility and work from home arrangements? And over 59% of the companies said yes. 11% though said they would be allowing more remote work, but on a limited basis. And then 16% were still considering or unsure. 7% will not be. Some of that could be those companies at which it's just not even possible. I know in our industry, in construction, we have kind of 3 different work groups. Those who really do need to be at the construction project site to serve our clients and work with our trade partners and design partners. Those who can work from home primarily, and then those who are hybrid, who spend time at both the project site and the office. And so balancing that and being flexible where we can with each of those groups has been our priority while keeping everyone safe. I do think that once the pandemic is over, we'll be continuing, most companies will be continuing some of that. I expect that it will kind of land somewhere in the middle. We'll take advantage of this increased use of technology where it makes sense, but also realizing we need that human connection, and we're always going to need that as human beings. And so balancing all that will be key. I also think that this greater empathy for our team members that most, I think, organizations have realized when we see in a Zoom conference call or a Zoom meeting somebody's pets or their children, or it really is a good human connection, even if we can't be together. And also just that neighborhood concept, I think, will be important for the future. And we're using that somewhat already here at McCown-Gordon, where we think of our teams as neighborhoods or our work groups, and then all of those neighborhoods together make up our community, our entire organization. And so keeping the engagement in those neighborhoods is key to keeping that human connection. So I think just the attention to mental wellness, mental health will continue. That's so important, and it's just as important as physical health and well-being, and then just being able to adapt quickly to any changes that need to happen. I see us getting better at that and having those protocols in place for the future and being able to adapt quickly as needed.
Absolutely. There's some additional slides to support some of the design around, to Nancy's points. Drew, do you want to?
Yeah. Just
on
very
this.
quickly, right? So again, we have to look at how do you take advantage of a demand that was already building, which is, we know some percentage of the ways we gather in business, it was some percentage of those meetings were kind of unneeded. And is there a way to create a digital experience, right, that can take advantage of that? And this is really the approach we've taken, right? You can actually still have a client interaction. You can still show off what you do in a digital forum that's unique and truly personal. And this is, so our virtual briefing center approach is what you're seeing here. This has been very effective for us. And again, it was because there was a demand that was already there. COVID accelerated it, but again, this was something the world was kind of needing because the technology was getting there for us to be able to do it. So again, this next slide is just a little bit more of it, but that is a good example of actually how to put this into practice.
Thank you for sharing that, Drew, and great insights, Nancy. This next question we don't have slides for, but we want to hear from Dominique initially. What are some of the design changes that should be considered in light of the behavioral changes that we've described previously?
Well, it's interesting because some of them really are virtual changes, and so they're not necessarily changes that are affecting our built environment so much. But it is really interesting in terms of our office, like how the engagement and the morale have changed with everything being on Zoom all the time. We've had to really make sure that people had access to good internet, sometimes paying for their internet service at home to make sure that they had that ability to connect. And then, sometimes it was, making sure that people had an Apple Pencil and a touch screen where they could really sketch and draw and share imagery and that sort of thing too. So, learning how to whiteboard in a different kind of way. But it's also what's been so interesting to see is the kind of entrepreneurial opportunity too of design when responding to the needs that come up, like the needs for plastic screening and floor stickers, and how you started to see those first temporarily put in place, and then these like really well designed signage elements started to get to pop up everywhere. We're looking and seeing more toe poles being used on doors, so we have more touchless options, and water and drinking fountains as well that are touchless. So I think it's going to continue to evolve and provide some opportunities for us to find more ways to just continue to be, more and more careful and hygienic in how we interact with our spaces. And the other thing that we've been kind of following and seeing is just where the industry is really doing well and where it's not doing so well. Residential is booming. Every residential contractor that we know is so busy they don't know what to do. The commercial side obviously isn't doing as well, but then you talk to people who are involved in data centers, and they're also incredibly busy. So you have these like much more specific sectors of the industry that are inordinately busy, and then other parts that are just really flatlined. And so it's been kind of, luckily for our firm, we're highly diversified and we had a pretty strong residential practice. And then of course, some of the civic work that's continued to move forward. So with, I'll talk more about the KCI project in a moment in terms of how we're integrating ideas there, but smart building solutions are coming into play as well, where we're thinking about how technology can be used to make the invisible more visible, right? Both in terms of, health and wellness, but maybe occupancy, right? So there's some technology companies that are trying to sense how many people are in a room. And if that exceeds the criteria for, safe distancing, then it sends out an alert. So there's some really interesting technologies that are kind of coming out of all of this that, are maybe short-term solutions to the problem that will probably have lasting implications to how we all work together.
Absolutely. Wayne, what would you add?
Yeah, I would just, add to that. I think from our sense, sorry, let me just start my video here. From our sense, I completely agree with those points, and I think we really look at when you look at environments, how do we give people a real sense of confidence, like particularly around transportation environments? How do we build that confidence for people coming through there? Like, we know that maybe people aren't crazy to travel right now, but when people start to travel, the first people or the early adopters that are traveling are going to express to everybody else, how safe did they feel during that travel experience? What was that experience like? Was it a good experience, a bad experience? And like Dominique was saying, when back in March, when everything went sideways, we saw people going with duct tape and Sharpies and pieces of colored Bristol board and putting up notices. Well, those types of things don't inspire confidence. So, what sort of overlays are we going to put onto our environments to start to build that? And what are those overlays going to become from a more permanent implementation? We're working on the airport there, sort of on the signage, wayfinding, and branding side. And what are we going to see as far as sort of digital communication that can effectively change as things change within the protocols? And I think everybody's trying to find what that moving target is, and it's a rapidly evolving moving target about what we're seeing that's happening. Like, are we going to have temperature checks? Are we going to have, and there's all these ideas. The short term, is there going to be an immunity passport? Is there going to be 5-minute testing that you can do, or 15-minute testing where you're put in a corral and then you're released if you're clear? What are those? And then when we look at those protocols, there needs to be a very dynamic system as those protocols change from short term to long term, and supporting all those things effectively with good design is incredibly important. So,
Absolutely. For me personally, I haven't been on an airplane since that first weekend of March, and I used to be a very frequent traveler, as did my husband. Wayne, I'm going to let you kick it off for us this time. Would love to know what we can anticipate when we get back to the airport environment. How do you see the travel experience being impacted long term after COVID? And I know you have some slides to share here.
Yeah. And we can just flip through these, because this was something that we worked on, and some of this was working on. We did a study for the Canadian airports around some guiding principles about how we get people back to traveling, and this idea of building passenger confidence, and what are the protocols around that, and even this idea of, can we in an airport realistically have a 6-foot social distancing requirement, which quite frankly is unlikely that type of protocol is a realistic, even short-term protocol, just given security lines and different areas of airports, and the fact that once you get on the airplane, you don't have that type of social distancing anyway. So, and how do we start to encourage self-service equipment? I think we're going to see a large boom in self-service security and passport control and things like that. So touchless technology. Who's going to want to check in at an airport with a physical ticket anymore? You're going to see those types of protocols are going to change very, very rapidly. And then this intuitive wayfinding is important, because how do we make sure people understand what those protocols are as they change and what the steps are? I think going through an airport 3 years from now is going to be a different process than what we had 12 months ago. So we're going to see those change, and in evolving that is going to require stakeholders, TSA or airlines or different regulatory bodies around that, so that there's protocols throughout all airports that are consistent, because you can't have one protocol in one place, another protocol somewhere else, if the two don't match up. So, and really building on that idea of promoting a safe environment. So if we just flip to the next slide, I think, when we look at airports, this is kind of the scenes we're seeing from airports right now, parked aircraft, empty terminal buildings. Do we think that's not gonna be forever? I think right now, sure, people are getting by, they're using Zoom, they're doing these types of things. People are getting a little burnt out from that, and I think that's a challenge. I mean, what do we learn from this? We've probably learned through this pandemic that maybe we don't need to travel as much for business, and maybe you know, we can be a little bit better with our business travel use. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing to use business travel when you need to, and you know, still make it a great experience. But I think that, you know, and if you look at the earlier slides that Danielle showed, I think we will see a more rapid return to pleasure travel, because people are going to want to people have this pent up aggression or pent up desire to go out and travel and to experience places. So I think we're going to see the shift of the types of travelers change over the next period of time, which is going to be interesting. And the airports are going to need to be designed around that for that recovery effort as that hits. And I think if we look at even 9/11 and the impact that had, a lot of airport projects actually slowed down during those 5 years, which actually created a problem for the next 5 years, because we had a real challenge with airports that did nothing for such a long period of time. Then they had to catch up on building up to match demand. So I think that, you know, the smart airports are still, we have a number of airports that are still going very strong with their program to keep things moving for that recovery. And just the next slide, I just sum up, I think that this idea of what the passenger experience is, well, it's changing, and you're going to see those things evolve. Always having a great experience and focusing, you know, those airports that focus on a great passenger experience. We're working with Changi Airport in Singapore, and they're always built around the focus of how do we create a great experience coming through this airport that really supports something very positive. So I think those environments that think about that and that focus on experience and making this great, we're going to see those airports really leading the future of environments. And I shouldn't even say airports. I think it's any environment where people come together, because you know, like humans have evolved over many, many millions of years and have come together in cities and have come together for social gatherings. I think a pandemic that's going to last a period of time is not going to change the DNA of people of wanting to get together and be social in groups. So I think we're going to see a return to people coming together, and I think it's got to be done in a very positive experience way. So.
Wayne, that's very encouraging to hear. I appreciate you sharing that, as I know it's been a trying year for many of us. You know, Dominique, elaborating on this concept of travel, and your firm is specifically involved with the KCI terminal expansion. Would love for you to talk through some of the things you're seeing in our town here.
Sure, yeah, so you can jump to the next slide already, and it's, you know, there's a lot of things that are being done. I mean, just first off, I'll jump in actually, because I don't have a slide for it. I probably should have just pulled in the TSA slide, but for folks who haven't traveled, TSA, you know, put in force a different protocol for going through security lines. You know, they're doing things like changing gloves every single time after every pat down. You're allowed to bring on 12 ounces of hand sanitizer with you, which before, you know, the limit was 3.4 ounces of any kind of liquid that you were allowed to bring. So hand sanitizer is okay. You know, it's a little bit different in terms of how the bins are being used. So they're trying to really avoid the use of bins, and all kinds of personal items need to go into your luggage instead of using bins. And you know, so they're being very, very cautious. There's several different additional things that are happening that are helping to ensure that there's a better, you know, safer outcome for passengers. But in terms of for KCI in particular, you know, we are using better air filtration systems, so MERV 13 filtration systems. Most of what's happening is really on the air conditioning, you know, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing system side. And I will move forward a slide here. One thing that was really interesting is this, something that's done typically in order to help filter the air due to the jet fuel. We're actually implementing in the terminal itself in order to help limit the spread of any kind of virus. So in particular, needlepoint bipolar ionization, which, I might even just kind of read this statement because it's kind of an interesting one, explaining the technology of what's going to be utilized. So essentially, it works to clean the indoor air by electronically charging it and creating a high concentration of positive and negative ions. And then these ions, they travel through the air and continuously, they kind of like seek and attach onto particulate matter. And so that allows the particulate matter, like, the virus, which is a pretty large particle matter, allows it to be eliminated more easily and filtered out. And also has a bit of a microbial effect as well, and that reduces the infective ability of the virus. So this technology is very novel and is going to be utilized at the airport. One more. So we don't have imagery yet for this. It's still being developed, and so we weren't ready to release it. But the millwork, which is like the check-in desks, and the areas where people would be interacting with airline staff, are going to be fitted with a nice way to include shields and guards so that it looks purposeful. So that's one thing that's also happening, but also is flexible in that it won't always be there. We're, like Wayne was saying, planning on this being a short-term need, and that eventually those guards can come down and we can go back to a little bit more face-to-face sort of interaction with everyone. Next slide. And then in the bathroom, so we've been really involved with the design of the restroom experience, and part of that is creating a flow where there are no doors to enter into the restroom. So we use more a path of travel in order to create that privacy. And then the fixtures are all touchless, the soap dispenser, and the faucet. We are not going to be using much of any air drying and hand dryers, because those tend to blow bacteria around the space. So we're actually going more with hand towels. So there are many things that we're doing in the restrooms to make sure that we're creating really clean surfaces as well that are easy to sanitize and clean. Next slide. So there's a better image of the restrooms themselves. And then kiosks is something that Wayne already kind of started to talk about. Those are really not so much a responsibility of the design team, because the airlines are going to be bringing those. But in certain airports, we are seeing touchless kiosks already being implemented. So we're hopeful that the airlines will be bringing those to play also at KCI.
Thank you, Dominique. It sounds like we can anticipate a lot of change when we get back to the airports. With that, Drew, this next question is for you. So whether we're traveling to our destination of leisure or we're enjoying some free time at our hometown, how are we changing the way we're spending our time outside of work with respect to sports, leisure, activities, etc.?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and we've studied this one. We've studied behavior, right, a lot, and emotions of people that want to attend events, and we know that people aren't attending many events right now, right? That's the current concern, but we also know, right? Let's put it this way: our concern initially is figuring out what is the real problem you're solving. A really good example to use, and you may have heard it, right, is TSA after 9/11. So TSA, right, sought to find who was carrying a weapon, right? That was the basic function of that process. Well, really what you're trying to figure out is who might be a terrorist, right? That's a very different thing. So what is born TSA pre, clear, right? That's actually solving the broader problem. So to apply that to today, what we have seen early on is people are trying to figure out how you abide by guidelines, right? That's not really the problem you're trying to solve, right? What we're trying to figure out is who has COVID and who doesn't, right? It's a little hard to do. So what can you do in the meantime? We look at it as simplifying is the easiest way to describe it. Again, so testing is starting to become more prevalent. That helps a lot. So now we can, you can require a test before you gather. And from there, right, the difference as well when we gather is we're trying to, as experiential designers, we're actually trying to reduce negative emotions versus amplify positive emotions. Normally for a game, an event, right, you want to get excited. Now we want you to be calm, which is a unique situation, but they're all short term. So we solve those short term problems by simplifying messaging, right? So at Mizzou is a good example. We created a zone and color system for attending the game, as opposed to abiding by 28 guidelines. We just said, remember your color and zone, the rest is taken care of. So when you get to your seat, you'll be socially distanced, right? You'll know where you need to be, where you need to go, because we know that at the end of the day, people are actually most afraid of other people. They're not, right? That's the major concern. We don't know how the people around us have been behaving. So how do we reduce that? So as we get testing, vaccine, whatever it may be, pandemic starts to go away, the question then is going to become, how are we going to gather again? And that one, we still know a little bit from history. We know how certain situations have impacted industries, whether it be movie theaters, entertainment. And we know that more than likely, people are not going to accept their previous experience. Right? We're not just going to repeat things exactly as they were, whether it be a game, a theme park, or whatever it is. We're probably going to have to adapt the offering to bring people back, to entice them back. Because in the short term, with financial issues, with COVID issues, you tend to be more local and you tend to spend less money, right? So we have to rethink about that offering of gathering again. And people, we definitely know, aren't going to do it until they really know the people around them don't have COVID, right? That's problem one. And then, problem two is, okay, let's do that. We also though know the airline industry is a good example. We also know oftentimes the supply will not meet the demand when it comes back, and it becomes a profitable scenario for that industry. In other words, airline travel saw passengers come back at a much higher level in year 5 and 6, but they did not offer as many flights, right? So it made flights full, and they can raise prices, and it becomes a more profitable scenario. Movie theaters saw the same. So you can also potentially expect that change in the given markets as we gather. So history tells us a lot. Very few challenges are actually all that unique, right? There really is a lot of things that tell us how that is likely to go. We don't know exactly what the solution needs to be, but that is what we know about gathering in the years to come, and it will be years.
Absolutely. And Drew, as the collegiate sports director there at your firm, you're close to that university relationship. So can you speak to how is the higher education system impacted, and what changes are being made that will last through the pandemic that you foresee?
Yeah. I mean, that one, it's a good example of, right, we kind of talked about it early on. Situations like this expose existing weaknesses, right? Or they take advantage of existing demand. Right? Positive, negative. So in this one, you had some real weaknesses in higher education before, right, any of this happened. You had real financial issues. The budgets were not aligning, right? You also had real social issues, right? And you had mental health issues. So all of those we're starting to see become, for lack of a better phrase, explode in this time. The positive in that is that it's going to force a change. So enrollment, the value of higher education, right? Those are the big ones. Ensuring that the product, if you will, of higher education is worth the cost. That is a huge challenge, to come. That has to get resolved one way or another. But I think we're seeing some, adaptation to that. I do think sadly, we're going to see some schools that just can't afford to stay open. But I think we'll also see a melding, emerging of programs and of offerings, and that maybe every university doesn't have every school, right? Every program that it currently does, that instead, you're going to see more specialization, more expertise. And then because it happens in these times, you're also going to see the rise of specialty, junior college technical programs, right? You're going to see enrollment does go up in times like these. So that's the positive. But what is that enrollment going to go to your major universities? Probably not. It's really re-enrolling in, part-time classes, and updating your skill set, those pieces. So I think we are going to see and are seeing a revolution at the traditional four-year institution level, because they're going to have to change their model. And we're going to see a rise in the technical capabilities of two-year institutions historically. Those are the big changes we can expect, because that financial model was just challenged. No different in healthcare, right? Healthcare, we're seeing the same thing. So those are the big ones.
Well, great insights, Drew, and I really appreciate that perspective on, we won't accept the way things used to be. This has given us a chance to evolve. With that, Nancy, looking at evolution in the workplace, what do you see this impact being on, campus recruiting, internships, interviewing, new employee orientation, and onboarding after the pandemic?
Yeah, there again, I think it's an acceleration of what was already starting to happen, which is the digital solutions become more and more used and accepted. Not that it's a complete replacement, but it definitely is. There are some advantages to virtual interviewing. It keeps the pipeline and the process moving along very quickly. And you can read body language in a video just like you can in person. And you can record it and go back to it and refer to it. And so there are a lot of good things about that. That being said, people usually want to meet in person before making that final decision. And I think that's a good practice as well. As far as college recruiting, most of the universities went away from the in-person career fairs and on-campus interviewing. A few of them had it on a limited basis. But most of the organizations and the universities got pretty creative and came up with some great solutions for that I think will also carry us forward into the future somewhat. I think ideally, the universities will want us back on campus. They like that interaction and the networking for their students. But I think some kind of a hybrid will probably be more the norm in the future. About 30% of the universities so far have already announced a virtual process for next year. The others yet to be determined. But for most of us who went through that process, it was pretty smooth and pretty efficient. As far as internships, I think most or a lot of the companies moved forward with internships in one way or another, even if it was virtual, and came up with some pretty creative solutions. I think the one part that is missing, or one of the parts that is missing, is that social interaction of the interns and the bonding there that happens, and that camaraderie. But I think there are even some ways to do that virtually too, that can be helpful.
Right. Right. We're getting close to our time here at 1, and we've had some great audience questions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and Nancy, we'll stay with you. One of the questions, and you kind of spoke to this within the internship program, is what do you think the short and long-term impact on employee morale and engagement is as a result of the pivot to digital?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It's something we've been studying and really trying to keep a pulse on. Change is hard for people, and when you put change on top of all the emotional aspects of a pandemic, it's tough. And what we found, though, is by being very intentional about how we engage with our associates, we have found kind of that boot camp effect, I'm calling it, where it's kind of like, we're going to do this and we're going to make it through this together. And it's almost bonding in some ways. And I'm hoping that that lasts. We've seen a lot of gratitude. We've seen a lot of gratitude for our company and other organizations who are being flexible and empathetic. We've seen a gratitude for teachers and family and coworkers and employees and associates who step up in the tough times, and also just an appreciation for the everyday. So those are all good things. And then I think just over time, we have to keep thinking of ways to get more creative, to engage people when we can't be in person, and have some of that human interaction that will help us keep us bonded in a more human and human connected way.
Yeah, I love that term, boot camp, and I'm going to have to utilize that moving forward. Now, this next question, I think I'll share over with Wayne, as you referenced that 6 feet social distant constraint isn't necessarily realistic in the airport environment. You know, do you believe that the dysfunction of the pandemic will be long-term criteria, or do you expect this will become a long-term space use constraint?
I think from certain places, it may be things that change. Like, we're working on some technology giants' offices, and they're not slowing down their office build because they're saying, from an office perspective, they're probably going to move to larger workstations to allow for greater social distancing, where before they'd use harvest tables and jam people at the table. So I think there's some moves that are going one direction. I think looking at airports, like if you thought about trying to load an A380 aircraft, I think that the number was the lineup would have to be almost half a mile long to load people at 6 feet apart. So you just can't queue huge groups of people at that sort of scale. The size that you'd have to make an airport. We've looked at some studies around that to reach pre-pandemic capacities of airports. They'd have to be 3 or 4 times the size of the buildings they are for waiting area, for queues, for all those spaces. So I think it's and not to mention with aircraft or with transit or anything like that, it's not like the vehicle, once you get on it, is going to be 4 times the size to be able to accommodate social distancing. So it's not going to accommodate that. So we really see it as a short-term design concern, and it has to be overcome to be realistic for designing environments. So.
Now, with that, we have just a couple minutes left. Dominique, I'd like to open up to you for any closing thoughts or remarks or insight that maybe wasn't previously shared.
Well, gosh, I mean, we started with these webinars, several months ago, starting to ask these questions of how can we design for this? How can we provide more comfort to the public in getting back out there? How can we, use our collective problem-solving capabilities in order to come up with new and better solutions? And so it's really interesting to see how it's evolved over the last several months. There's still a lot that we definitely don't know, which is the title of this webinar. But I also feel like we know more, right? So that's a good thing. It was exciting to see the kind of fun ways that people are getting outside and finding ways to socialize, in our parks and on our sidewalks and all of that, which we talked about in the previous webinar. But I think it's just, it's made me realize just how important design is, and also looking historically at this, right? Like how really important design is to our collective health and wellness, and how it's all so interconnected in terms of epidemiology and the built environment.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank our panelists for this great insight and information. Their information is again provided here on the slide in front of you, and also to our member firms of KC Global Design for putting on this event. Dominique had referenced our previous webinars. Again, this is the 6th that we've held this year in response to this pandemic. So if there's any others that you'd be interested in viewing, you can find them all on our website, kcglobaldesign.com. Again, thank you to our panelists. You provided outstanding information, and I know for me it was hugely beneficial to get that historical context too, to really put things in perspective, and reassuring to know that great work our design experts are putting into solving these problems long term for us. So thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.